Hello and welcome. I'm Dr. Adam Dorsey, a psychologist in Silicon Valley, and I am the host of Super Psyched, a podcast dedicated to supercharging your life. Each episode contains fun, high-quality interviews with experts looking at psychology from all angles. Super Psyched is your tool to get more of what you want in your life and less of what you don't. Psychopath is a word we see a lot these days. Have you ever wondered what the word psychopath really means? Perhaps you've heard some other related terms like sociopath or malignant narcissist and wondered about them as well. If so, you'll be fascinated by what my guest has to say. Today's episode is all about dark personalities with a focus on the mind of a psychopath. While today's expert goes deep into the darker aspects of the human condition, he is a very kind person and someone who has my deepest respect, Dr. Reid Meloy. His list of accomplishments and credentials is long and impressive, and here are some highlights. Reid is a board-certified forensic psychologist who consults on criminal and civil cases throughout the U.S. and Europe. He is a clinical professor of psychiatry at the University of California, San Diego, and is past president of the American Academy of Forensic Psychology. He has authored or co-authored over 240 papers published in peer-reviewed psychiatric and psychological journals and has authored or co-authored or edited 12 books. His first book, The Psychopathic Mind, was an integration of the biological and psychodynamic understanding of psychopathy. He has been consulting, researching, and writing about psychopathy, stalking, narcissism, criminality, and targeted violence for the past 30 years. So listen in as Reid and I go deep into understanding the mind of a psychopath. Please note, for the first 2.5 minutes, we get pretty thick into the weeds of psychological diagnosis, and I'm leaving it in. But fear not, the rest of the interview is easily understood. And of course, trigger warning, this material may be evocative at times and is certainly not suitable for children. If you have small children around, please consider listening to this episode in your headphones or at another time. Reid Meloy, welcome to Super Psyched. I'm so happy to have you here.
Thanks, Adam. My pleasure to be with you today.
Great. So we're talking about psychopathy, and the term psychopath and the term sociopath are terms that are thrown around a lot in the common, in the media, out in the world. Can you define what those terms actually mean?
Sure. The term sociopath actually goes back to the about the 1950s, and it was considered to be applied to individuals who were behaving in antisocial ways because of living in a criminal environment, as opposed to the psychopath that was considered to be more a personality constellation that had a heavier biological basis to it. The term sociopath actually, though, is now only used typically by the popular press, and you do see that used a lot still in television and in the movies, but the research has focused on psychopathy or the psychopathic personality. And the word sociopath typically does not show up in the science and the scientific work that's been done in this area for probably going back at least half a century. And in fact, the American Psychiatric Association tossed out the word sociopathy or sociopath back in 1968 when DSM-2 was introduced. So the term itself is pretty much an anachronism, but it still has to be used in the popular literature. Yeah. And if you were to define psychopath or the psychopathic mind or psychopathic traits, what does that mean? Yeah, the term psychopath, the kind of the quick and easy definition of it is it's an individual who typically has a pattern of chronically antisocial behavior and also has a clear lacking of any kind of empathy for other people. They tend to regard other people with a callousness that in most cases is actually quite surprising for the normal person observing a psychopath. So callous, unemotional traits describe the psychopath very well, coupled with an individual who will engage in various antisocial activities over the course of time.
Yeah, so it sounds like a person with psychopathic traits or somebody who is a full-blown psychopath is born that way.
It's largely a biologically based disorder, which really comes as a surprise to most people. In fact, the more severe the psychopathy is in the individual, the greater the what we call biological loading or inheritance of the disorder. We know that about 50% of personality is inherited, and about 50% of it is shaped by the environment. And of course, the nature and nurture do interact with each other. It's never either or. It's how does one shape the other. But with psychopathy, again, the more severe the psychopathy, the greater the biological loading for the disorder.
Sure. And it sounds like there's also a scale, almost various grades of how psychopathic an individual is. Can you share a little bit about that?
Sure. There was the gold standard that we have for measurement of psychopathy was an instrument developed by Robert Hare, who's actually started out as an experimental psychologist in Canada, and he's been at the University of British Columbia for decades. And Bob is now a professor emeritus, but he has trained and educated lots of doctoral students that have then gone on in their own right to become professors and researchers around the world. So he developed this instrument, which is essentially what we call an ordinal scale that measures the degree of psychopathy in an individual. And typically the measurement is done by looking at different characteristics of the person. In psychopathy, we're looking at traits versus states. And I'll kind of make the distinction.
Sure.
Yes, states tend to be things that come and go. So we could be anxious, we could be in an anxious state of mind, or we could be depressed one day and not another, and feel kind of down one day and not another. Those are states of mind. Psychopathy, though, we're talking about traits, which are enduring characteristics in the individual that typically are developed early on. Many of them are inherited, and they typically don't change much depending on what's happening in the environment. They're very stable and enduring characteristics that we call oftentimes personality.
Yeah, and one of the things that I believe you identified was what used to be called a triad of descriptors, and it's become a tetrad over time that you've described that includes such traits as narcissism, Machiavellianism, sociopathy, and more recently, sadism. Are those the four?
Yeah, those are the four, Adam, but I must say that I didn't. That wasn't my discovery. I wish it was.
This whole time
it's been an important advance. And the work actually began probably in earnest around 15 years ago by Dr. Paulus. And the concept, though, is correct, that it's a way to think about what we call subclinical traits in an individual, meaning that they don't arise to the level of a full-blown personality disorder, but those subclinical traits in the dark triad are correct. They're psychopathy, Machiavellianism, and narcissism, and that's called the dark triad. And then in the past decade, a fourth one has been added, which is called sadism, and that's why it's now referred to as the dark tetrad. The research in there has been very, very prolific, and I think typically in science, when research tends to accelerate in an area, it means that things are being discovered and things are being tested that appear to have value from the scientific community. So the research in that area has accelerated. There's been some very interesting studies. One of my favorite studies in that area is a study that was done by Paulus and his colleagues, and the title is one of my favorites, is Trolls Just Want to Have Fun. And it's basically it was a study that was done online looking at the personality characteristics of people that engage in trolling. Trolling being, mischievous, disruptive, oftentimes hurtful behavior on the internet. And of course, it turned out that in this very large, non-random study that was done on the internet, that individuals who do engage in trolling tend to be more psychopathic and more sadistic than other individuals that typically are on the internet day in and day out. So trolling is an activity where we can infer, particularly for people that really like to troll and spend a lot of time doing that we can infer that they have now certain psychopathic and sadistic traits in their personalities.
You say trolls just want to have fun, and I was thinking that, oh my gosh, ever since the advent of the internet, it must be a spectacular playground for psychopaths and people with psychopathic traits.
I think that's absolutely true, Adam. A lot of it is because oftentimes there's no social consequences for your behavior on the internet. You can do things and get away with things that you just couldn't get away with in the real world. And so for individuals that are without conscience, that have no internalized moral values, and for individuals that enjoy the infliction of suffering on other people, and that is a textbook definition of sadism, is enjoyment of the suffering of others, then the internet is like a very, very large playground for an individual of that ilk. And it can be very destructive. It can be emotionally destructive, intellectually destructive, and of course socially, and sometimes even it can move online into on-the-ground behavior. It can become physically destructive of people.
Sure. Yeah, cyberbullying, so many other activities that transpire on the web that are really new in the zeitgeist, or relatively new anyway, and can really cause profound harm. I remember bringing you to visit the safety team and the counterterrorism team over at Facebook and talking about that. If you could unpack a few things, just the definitions, so
sure,
everybody understands within the dark tetrad, what is narcissism? What is Machiavellianism? What is, well, you mentioned sociopathy earlier, and what is, and you've already defined sadism, but how about particularly with regard to narcissism and Machiavellianism?
Yeah, these are interrelated traits. So they're not, as we say, independent of each other, and that is, of course, can be tested statistically as to how things are related to one another. So there is an intercorrelation among these four traits, but they typically are not the same as one another. When we think about psychopathy, we're thinking again about active deception, manipulation of other people, exploitation of other people, callously disregarding their rights and feelings. When we think about narcissism, we're largely thinking about somebody who is self-absorbed and is only focused on their self-interest. And you can see the overlap with psychopathy, but also they're separate. Like you can have what we refer to as people who are benignly narcissistic. They typically don't aggressively want to hurt other people to advance their self-interest, but they generally just focus on themselves. So they're, in a sense, kind of benignly indifferent to the needs of others, but they're not aggressing against other people to satisfy their own needs, like we see in psychopaths. Thirdly, Machiavellianism is, again, associated with narcissism and psychopathy, but it has more to do with the use of schemes and scams and strategies to advance one's own interest. And then sadism, as I defined, is pleasure through the suffering of another. So again, these have been teased apart. You can see how they're related to each other, but also there are differences among these four traits.
You know, it's interesting. Not long ago, my wife received a call from a man who said he was from the sheriff's department, and that there was a court case involving her as a psychologist, and it was really scary. And lo and behold, it was, in fact, just a Nigerian prince scheme where somebody was saying, give us some money and everything will be fine. When I hear you talking about just this kind of bloated self-interest and harming other people, these are the types of things I'm thinking of, as well as catfishing that's so frequent in the dating world, where somebody portrays himself as the world's nicest guy, and then lo and behold, he asks for money, and the innocent, naive person gives that money.
If I could say something about that, Adam, because it's a really interesting dynamic that's actually been studied a lot. And it has to do with not only the behavior of the psychopath, but what's going on internally with him. And it's called the manipulative cycle, and this might be helpful to readers. And the cycle has 4 stages to it. The first one is that there's a goal conflict between you and the psychopath, that he wants something from you that ordinarily you wouldn't give up if it was something that was honestly being asked for. Secondly, there's a deceptive scheme that is developed by the psychopath to get what he wants from you, and this fits nicely into the catfishing. Thirdly, the deceptive act is carried out successfully. And then the 4th stage is an internal emotional state for the psychopath, and it's called contemptuous delight. That he feels contemptuously delighted by what he's done to you. Now, when you and I are the victims of the psychopath's exploitation, typically we will feel a number of things, ranging from anger to shame to humiliation to in a sense, an erosion of our own self-esteem, that we are conned as easily as we were. But for the psychopath, his internal state is, again, contemptuous delight. And if we unpack that a little bit, it also is very interesting. Contempt is a universal emotion.
Sure.
But within contempt, there's always a looking down upon another person. You're judging another person from a position of superiority. And then, of course, delight is pleasure. So these two together is where the psychopath is literally looking down on his victim and relishing in the pleasure of showing the victim how stupid or gullible or naive or suggestible they were. And he takes pleasure from that. Unlike you and I, who at that point in time would likely feel guilt or remorse for having done something that was dishonest or deceitful. From a behavioral psychology perspective, there's also an interesting take on this too, in that when he does get to contemptuous delight, we now have what's called an intermittent positive reinforcement schedule.
Yes.
Meaning he's likely to do it again.
Yes.
And if you and I deceive somebody and we feel guilty, again, the punishment from our own internal values, our own what we call superego, is oftentimes so intense that we're less likely to do that again. So the psychopath will engage in this manipulative cycle over and over and over again. And the internet has been an incredible playground for him to carry on these exploitations of other people, enjoying the contemptuous delight with hardly ever suffering any kind of consequence, any kind of negative consequence.
Wow. So I wonder how you would differentiate between contemptuous delight and schadenfreude, which I understand, as I understand it, is taking pleasure in another person's pain. And there's an entire industry. We just go into the checkout lines at a supermarket and we see Us Magazine and we find out how badly people are faring and taking pleasure in that, for example.
That's a great question, Adam. One of the differences is, when you're looking at the movie magazines in the checkout line, and in a sense, kind of enjoying, the displeasure or the suffering of a celebrity figure, you aren't inflicting that suffering on them. You're in a sense a passive viewer of that. So there's a difference there. But you've hit upon a very important thing, And that is that sadism, taking pleasure through the suffering of another, is actually a in very muted levels, is very much a part of our species. And people that are listening to this may think, well, that doesn't apply to me. I'm not sadistic.
Right.
But think about the times in your life, and I know every listener has had this experience. Think about the times in your life when you've teased somebody. Teasing is socially acceptable sadism.
Right.
Because what are you doing? You are doing something deliberate to make somebody else uncomfortable, and you are taking pleasure in their discomfort. That's socially acceptable sadism. We have another word for it in our society. We call it teasing. But if you take that and think about that on sort of dimensionally or on a continuum, as that becomes more and more intensified and magnified and exaggerated, we get into some really difficult, painful, destructive behavior. So one of the first steps in this entire area is just to acknowledge that we all, at various times, can have sadistic impulses, and then the choice becomes: do we satisfy them or not?
It's interesting. Yesterday I was listening to a podcast with Conan O'Brien interviewing Ricky Gervais, two really world-class comedians, and both of them sharing in the pleasure they derive from taking people down a notch, teasing people. And Ricky, if I'm quoting him correctly, basically said, it's kind of like wolf cubs who are not nipping at each other and finding the line that they can't cross. And it sounds like it is really hardwired in our species to do these types of things. Perhaps there's an evolutionary basis. Perhaps it's to make us stronger. What are your thoughts on why do we engage in this sadistic behavior?
Yeah, that's a great question. Evolutionarily, I'm not sure, but I know it has something to do with, in the larger evolutionary picture, it has something to do with dominant submission. And if you think about just dominant submission, then, of course, somebody like me, my thoughts move to, in a sense, the animal kingdom, predatory prey. Predatory prey behavior is about dominant submission behavior. That's very close to what we're talking about. But I think the difference is the sort of unbridled pleasure that's taken in sadism through the dominance of suffering and suffering of another. And in mostly in the animal kingdom, although I think there are some exceptions, most of the behavior in the animal kingdom that involves predatory prey or dominant submission typically does not involve pleasure on the part of the animal. Typically it's being done in one very large area, of course, it's a paradigm for hunting, that you're engaging in predatory behavior to hunt the prey, but there isn't necessarily pleasure that's taken in the suffering of the victim. In fact, you'll even talk to hunters who will hunt for sport or hunt game in the wild, and they will talk about the importance of a clean kill and not wanting the animal to suffer. And when you get into hunting that involves any level of sadism, pleasure through the suffering of the animal, whether that animal is a deer that you're hunting, or if you're a psychopath, you're hunting another human being. As soon as you're taking pleasure through the induction of fear in that victim, you're now in the realm of sadism, which I think in our species, of course, is very destructive. But you see it at all kinds of levels.
So, with regard to traits of a psychopathic individual, one of them is the absence of empathy. And yet there's this paradoxical reality where they are so able to read the emotions of another individual. Yeah. Can you speak about that? So often I've even heard of people being destroyed in relationships, feeling as though, oh my gosh, he understood me so well, and then he just turned on a dime.
Yeah, that's a great question, Adam, and it does move into an area that's been pretty paradoxical in people that are interested in psychopaths and people that have done research, and that is if they if they have no capacity for empathy, how can they be such great manipulators of other people? And how can they be such exquisite readers of other people's behaviors? And it's a bit of a lengthy explanation, but I think I can do it in a way that that's relatively clear. Psychopaths, severely psychopathic individuals, are what we call limbically disconnected. Is that they don't experience the socialized emotions that you and I experience, such as gratitude, empathy, sympathy, reciprocal pleasure, reciprocal joy, thankfulness for the behaviors of other individuals. What they do instead is experience emotions that tend to be what we refer to as pretty primitive. In other words, emotions that don't necessitate any kind of attachment to other people or any kind of anxiety concerning relationships. We know that severe psychopaths typically don't form attachments or bonds to other people. We know that this is largely biologically based. And we also know that psychopaths have minimal or no anxiety, particularly in social situations. Now, if we take that information, no attachment, no anxiety, limbic disconnection, and we talk about the question that you just raised, I think it hopefully will become clear. And the notion is that when the psychopath is in a social situation, he doesn't have the cognitive load of anxiety and attachment. Therefore, his observational acuity is better. And I call this, in some of my writings, I call it predatory acuity. When you and I talk, like we're doing right now, and before I started, of course, I was feeling some anxiety. I'm thinking about my schedule for the rest of the day. I'm thinking about, and then of course the video didn't work when we were first started to chat. And so I had to pause and we had to take some time to get that fixed. And those are all anxiety generators for me. That's what we call cognitive load. It's what our emotions, in a sense, are heavily influencing our thinking. But the psychopath is bereft of those socialized feelings. The psychopath, if you were interviewing a psychopath right now, Adam, and his audio wasn't working, he could give a shit.
Exactly.
And he could give a shit about how it was affecting you.
Right.
And that absence means that he can also be looking at you and watching you and listening to you and be much more acutely aware of your behaviors. So from a predator-prey perspective, the more acuity you have as a predator, the greater the likelihood that you're going to be able to find your prey and kill it.
It's as if the brain were a computer and all of the RAM space was free and able to be allocated towards that predatory behavior.
Yeah, I think so, Adam. And this is a theory. It's a theory that I've done some work with and writing about, and other people have come at this from a different perspective. We actually did a paper last year on, we call it social, sexual, and violent predation. Are psychopathic traits evolutionarily adaptive? And it's a scholarly paper. It's in a science journal, but we wanted to explore this area of, and I think that there's a lot of scientific data that supports the notion that psychopaths are the intraspecies predators in our society, and that there are certain wirings and certain biologically based characteristics in the psychopath that makes him a better predator.
And you mentioned him, and I believe the incidence of psychopathy is far greater amongst males. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, it probably runs at about a ratio of the gender difference, probably about 5 to 1. So we know that severely psychopathic males, perhaps 1 out of 100 men are severely psychopathic, and only probably about 0.2% of women would be severely psychopathic. So the numbers tend to be tend to be much smaller. So there is a very clear gender aspect to psychopathy.
And to go back to the evolutionary purpose, it's almost as if what I was hearing is within our species, it's almost a weeding out of people through the actions of a psychopath. What is the evolutionary purpose of the existence of these individuals?
I don't know. Frankly, I don't know. There's some speculations. Some people have thought, well, they make in wartime, they make for really good, very good warriors. Actually, it was the origin of the term berserk. The Vikings had their berserkers, and these were people that they sent out at times of war to go berserk, and to kill the enemy. The problem is, and some people have said this to me, well, does that mean that all warriors, all individuals, particularly those that are involved in special operations or special forces, are psychopaths? And I say absolutely not, because what you need in a group of special operators is you need tremendous closeness and bonding among the individuals, and also tremendous control over their behaviors in order to have a good squad,
Sure.
operating very smoothly. And that would, of course, apply to other, in a sense, very sophisticated tactical units that we see in our society that keep society safe. So you can't take that notion of simply put and just say, well, psychopaths make good warriors and that's why they're there. I think it's an aberration genetically. I think it is a genotype in our species, like schizotypy. I think psychopathy is a genotype. I think it's very stable and steady. It represents and stays in the species as a very, very small element of the species. We do know something about their reproductive patterns. Most individuals in our species will tend to develop kinship networks and reproduce in families. And evolutionarily, the family, of course, is there to raise the young so they can produce again, and then the genes stay in the pool. But because psychopaths don't form attachments, this doesn't work for them in terms of reproduction. They don't have kinship networks. You'll never see psychopaths having a family reunion.
Right.
They're not going to be getting together to celebrate anything. But their mating strategy is very different. They do what we call search polygyny. In other words, they impregnate as many different women as possible in different geographic locations, which we think keeps them viable in the gene pool. So it's another reproductive strategy besides the familial kinship strategy that most people are, very much aware of, and frankly, most people try to form.
To your earlier point about the soldier, it's my tiny amounts of understanding of Navy SEALs. The most elite soldiers are very team-oriented, so that rules out the possibility that they could be psychopaths. One of the things that I've also noticed that's been troubling in the zeitgeist has been a proliferation of dating tips books and leadership or power tips books that seem to espouse psychopathic behaviors. If you read through them, they are actually rather disturbing. Have you come across any of that?
Yeah, and sadly, I don't think that's new. There have been books through the decades, that have kind of focused on the, in a sense, the cold exploitation of other people to get ahead. And you're right; those are psychopathic traits that, in certain areas of our society, do get rewarded at various times. But I have found through my career that generally, severely psychopathic individuals will self-destruct over time. And one of the reasons, which again is, I think, really interesting, is they tend to be tactically very shrewd, but strategically they fail. In other words, they're very good at short-term manipulation, but long-term strategic planning is not done well at all, and it tends to lead them down the path eventually of self-destruction. There's of course a number of reasons for that. One of the interesting ones is that we think they're what's called the prefrontal cortical area of the brain of the psychopath works differently from normals, in the sense that they don't have that ability to, in a sense, the wiring to strategically plan like other people can, but the short-term tactical manipulation is very, very good. And this, again, is marked quite readily. You'll see this in the news of individuals who have been psychopathic failures. Some of the most recent ones that come to mind for me, when I first started reading about Jeffrey Epstein and his behavior and his pedophilic behavior, a lot of the descriptors suggested to me, as I'm reading it, that this was an individual that was likely psychopathic. And then as more data became apparent and was publicized in the news, it just confirmed for me that this man was likely had a psychopathic personality. Another case in point that I thought was that I was drawn to try to understand a little bit was the Larry Nassar case, who was the physician for USA Gymnastics, who over the course of several decades
Yes.
has sexually exploited these young girls, most of them minors, and in some cases was able to sexually abuse these women, these young girls, even when the parents were in the examination room with him and the young girl. And I found that extraordinarily, of course, not only deceptive and manipulative, but it suggested to me that that here was a likely psychopathic personality. And then, of course, as more data came out, you saw the elaborate scheming and scamming he was using. You saw the absence of conscience, the complete absence of remorse for what he had done to these young girls, right up to and including the trial, where he had written the judge a very kind of self-focused plea for forgiveness on her part, which was just, I thought, in my mind, I thought was quite pathetic, but not surprising. So these cases do emerge. Epstein and Nassar being two most recently that have been heavily in the news. Also, I think we would want to look very carefully at Harvey Weinstein. And think about the psychopathic traits in Weinstein.
Sure. In other words, tactics versus strategy. You're basically saying they're very good at the sprint, but not at the marathon.
Correct.
And they are very influential in the moment and very capable of swaying people to their side, it would appear, perhaps even through tactics like gaslighting. Well put. And I had a old probation officer friend from Georgia years ago said this to me. He said, Reid, he said, a psychopath's monkey with your mind. And I thought it was just a great, simple expression of gaslighting. Can you explain what gaslighting is? Yeah, sorry.
Well, just this notion of being able to rationalize and manipulate data and float what appear on the surface to be very plausible but turn out to be very false arguments that will tell you that the sky is red over and over and over again, till finally you look at the sky and say, it does. There is a shade of red there. I think it is red. These notions of being able to turn what we consider sacred values on their heads. I had one case years ago who was a very, very bright psychopath who was doing a television interview, and by the end of the interview, even some of the television crew were nodding their heads at what he was saying.
Amazing.
And one of the things he did was he characterized how one of his pitches was that that everybody in prison is a victim of society, and that people need to organize in prisons against the victimization that they're suffering by society. And, the psychopath, particularly the bright psychopath, can bring in and sprinkle and cherry pick facts to, in a sense, turn your values on their head to where you're doubting your own reality perception and are confused by the thoughts that you're having. And we think about that as gaslighting. That's from that the movie Gaslight that came out in the 1940s. But again, this notion of psychopaths monkeying with your mind, I think, is a really nice expression that sort of captures the way he can confuse and distort your own reality if you're around him enough.
It's amazing. And I think about Stockholm Syndrome, identifying with the aggressor. And Stockholm Syndrome, I believe, can probably happen on a large scale if the leader is effective enough or charismatic enough. Does that...
Well, totalitarian leaders, like, if we think about Kim Il-chung in South Korea, will take totalitarian leadership is about totality of control. And so if you control all the alternative interpretations of reality to a people and literally cut off their contact with the outside world, then you can shape their perceptions, and you can convince, as he has done with North Korea, as he has convinced, it appears, the North Koreans are convinced largely that the United States is about ready to imminently attack the North Koreans, and there needs to be this creation of the largest military in the world, which North Korea has, the largest number of soldiers in the world, that despite the starvation that's rampant throughout society, we still have to stay at this level of imminent military readiness because we're about to be invaded. That's a way to create a totality of control of the mind that allows a leader like him to survive. So, and typically with those kinds of leadership patterns, you do see severely psychopathic individuals such as Adolf Hitler, Stalin, Idi Amin, Pol Pot in Cambodia, what used to be called Cambodia. And you see these characters who arise onto the world stage and frankly create destruction in their wake.
Incredible. And yet, I believe 20% of the prison population, in spite of the fact that the incidence of psychopathy is about 1% amongst males in the general population, the prison is comprised 20%. Is that correct?
Yeah, you're going to be upwards of the figure I would give right now is like probably 15 to 25% of maximum security prisoners are psychopathic males. Rates tend to be a bit lower for females that are in maximum security. But of course, because typically psychopaths will engage in more predatory violence than normals do, we know that factually, that there are much higher rates of predatory violence in psychopaths than in normals. They're more likely to be the ones that will be prosecuted for violent felonies and will end up in prison. So we would expect them to cluster in our prisons, and they do worldwide. If you're going to go look for psychopaths, then go to maximum security, and that's where you're going to find them. And it's you see clusterings sort of following the logic of where they're likely to be.
It's incredible. I want to ask a question, spoiler alert, about neurotypicals and why we are so suggestible to the power of the psychopath. But before that, a vignette that will not surprise you at all, but surprised me when I heard it. A forensic psychologist friend of mine was describing working at a prison, and while she was there, a female psychiatrist was charmed by a prisoner, fell in love with him, lost her job, lost her license. Yeah. And I find myself wondering, and I know that part of it was the exceptionalism that we want to feel, oh my gosh, I'm the only one who can actually help this person. But I'm wondering, how do we, so-called neurotypicals, how are we so vulnerable to their power?
Yeah, that's a great question, Adam. It comes in a variety of ways. One of the appeals is that the psychopath, and here I'm thinking about sort of money exploitation, and of course we see a lot of that in our society. We're going to see more of it now as we're in the incredibly difficult stretch that we're in now in terms of the virus as well as the economic fallout from it. But in the area of economics, a lot of times the psychopath will use the victim's narcissism as a means to lure them in. For instance, like I would say, Adam, I have a very I tell you I'm running a investment fund, and there's some great opportunities here. But Adam, I'm sorry the fund is closed right now.
Oh my gosh, but I want in.
Exactly. Well, Adam, it's only giving you a steady return of 10%.
10% is huge.
That you can guarantee. Yeah, but Adam, it's closed right now.
But I want in.
Oh, Adam, I'm sorry. I know I really like you, and a nice guy. Let me go look and see if there's a means by which we can make an exception and let you come into the fund and invest your hard-earned money. Now, I can most people want to invest $100,000, but there's only room for another 50 from you. So
I've got it. I will find a way to get it to you, Reid, by noon if necessary.
Well, actually, if I can only open it for a couple hours, Adam. So,
oh gosh.
Okay. I wouldn't typically do this unless with somebody I really liked a lot. So I'm going to hold back. But what do you think? Do you want to?
Yeah.
You think you can get that?
I'll find it. I will borrow it. I will find a way to get that money to you.
Wire it, transfer it into my account in the next 30 minutes.
Done. So that's how it works.
But that's it. See, what I do is I tell you there's a special group that you can join, but then I tell you that you can't join it right now. And what that stimulates in you, of course, is a desire to be a part of the special group and to let you inside. And so that becomes the carrot that I dangle in front of you. And then I withdraw the carrot. But pretty soon, like we just did in our fun little spontaneous role play, pretty soon you're begging me to take your money. And if I come to you and had demanded you give me money, of course, you would have backed off completely. But see, we saw this kind of exploitation in the 07, 08, 09.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that.
Recession. And the narcissistic dangle, for instance, for the predatory lenders was that, Adam, you can live in a $10 million home. And now's the time, because of the very, very special low rates that I can give you on the mortgage, no down payment whatsoever, and we'll get you into that home. And see, the appeal there is to your sense of wanting to aspire to a position of status, to be in this beautiful home. So you're likely to take risks that you wouldn't otherwise take because of the appeal of being treated in a special way. So that's one of the mechanisms by which the psychopath will, exploit and manipulate other people. If that doesn't work, psychopaths oftentimes will box you in through some coercive tactic, and then demand you do something, and you will do it because of the coercive hold that he has on you. That's why it's so important that people, in a sense, try to not provide other individuals with ammunition that they can use against them. For instance, cheating on your tax returns, having extramarital affairs, doing anything that creates vulnerabilities in you or vulnerabilities for you historically. That is catnip for the psychopath.
Sure. And sadly, I'm a huge fan, with regard to this, I'm a huge fan of Brene Brown and her idea that vulnerability and strength are one and the same, except when it's in an exchange, it sounds like, with a psychopath who can and will use it against you.
Yeah, they will. Yeah, they will. They're one of the predatory acuities is their ability to identify your narcissistic vulnerabilities. One of the ones, like you know this field well in terms of psychotherapy. One of psychotherapists' vulnerability is their narcissistic belief that they can heal other people.
Sure.
And within that, typically, is that there's a certain level of grandiosity within that. There's a certain level of entitlement on the part of the psychopath that they believe that they have a capacity to heal others. The psychopath will exploit that, and he will present. If you were in treatment with a psychopath, he will hold a mirror up to you, showing you what a wonderful job you're doing with him. And so as you look at yourself in the mirror and admire your good work with the psychopath, he's walking you down the path to a position of coercion where he can then exploit you.
So, Reid, a bit of a confession. Back when I was an intern at a clinic, I was working with gang-affiliated youth, and I was working with a 15-year-old boy who had a really sad backstory. And he and I had a really powerful connection. I was giving him extra time. I was providing him with what felt like, corrective fathering in a way, and getting him back on track. And then I found out he had been lying the entire time. I walk into my supervisor's office, who has a spectacular forensic background, and I said to him, "Jorge, I cannot believe it. He lied to me, this guy." And Jorge, my boss, who loves telling the story, Dr. Wong, if you're out there listening, I'm sure you're going to be laughing. He falls onto the ground, starts pounding the floor, and said, "What did you expect, Adam? That's what they do." And I had that sense of exceptionalism at the time. I had this I imagine it was part narcissism, but it was part, fantastical and wish.
Yeah.
And part of me just really, it was like, wow, this is my fantasy to be the super therapist. Yeah. And lo and behold, all those hopes were dashed in a second.
Yeah, I had that's a great example, Adam. I had kind of a related one, but somewhat different, but it's an illustration of what we call projective identification, which is a technical kind of term that we use in our field. But I was...
before you do that, can you explain what projective identification is?
Sure, yeah. Projective identification is where you attribute, and typically this is done unconsciously by the person, but you attribute a characteristic to somebody else that actually is within you, but it's not a complete projection, and so you then feel threatened by that characteristic that's now in the other person, and it's very, very. It's a primitive defense, but it oftentimes is used, particularly by psychopathic individuals. But to illustrate it, I think the illustration will help. This was a guy who was on trial for murder, and I was seeing him in a maximum security setting, and I thought I was doing counseling with him, and he was again going through his murder trial. At the time, I would counsel him like once or twice a week, and I'd see him in a maximum security counseling. It was a psychiatric unit that we had established within this setting, and. But he began to report to me other murders he'd committed. Now, I know that as a psychologist that information is historical information, and that is protected by confidentiality.
Sure.
And so he also knew that information would go nowhere. At least I thought he knew that. And he had told me about 3 or 4 other murders he'd committed. And then one day he sat down with me in the counseling session. He said, Dr. Meloy, you know a lot about me now, and sometimes when people know too much, they get killed.
Oh God!
And I was, I was literally frozen by that.
Yeah.
In a sense, I was frozen by his projective identification, that he had put knowledge into me about him.
Yes.
And I can't evacuate that. I can't somehow in my mind no longer have that information.
You can't expunge it.
He placed that into my mind. But then he felt threatened by it. He felt threatened by the information that I now held about him. And then for him, that perceived threat moved him to a position, of homicidally threatening me in the session. And then, one of the clearest things is that I remember feeling frozen and not knowing what to say, but then looking at him and watching a sly smile come across his face, which was his sadism, that he was enjoying the extreme discomfort I was in at that moment. I, in a sense, consoled myself by saying, well, Reid, and this was, again, just to me, talking within my own mind, Reid, you get to leave tonight, and he doesn't.
Right.
But he's in maximum security, and he's not going anywhere. And I was going to be able to, to not be in that particular setting with him. But it was very frightening, but it was a great lesson on that particular psychological mechanisms, as well as how a psychopath can regale you with his antisocial exploits and then turn around and use that information as a way to coerce your behavior. I want to comment on the psychiatrist that you mentioned, who fell in love with.
Sure.
Historically, typically the people that are most vulnerable to the psychopath in prison settings and in forensic hospitals do tend to be young women, and I don't say that in any kind of sexist sense. I say that because most psychopaths are men. Right. Most psychopaths are heterosexual, and the people that they're going to have contact with the most, especially in forensic hospitals, are relatively young nurses, aides, and what we call psychiatric technicians that have limited education, that are spending the most time in the modules with the patients or with the inmates. And so they're going to be, in a sense, they not only bring to it the greatest number of vulnerabilities, but they're spending the most time with the psychopathic men. Those are the women. We did one study at a forensic hospital in California and found that of psychopathic men, and found that 38% of them had a consensual sexual relationship with a female staff member. 38%. So the numbers are really quite extraordinary, and that was not their self-report. That was from administrative files, at the forensic hospital. So the exploitation risk is very high in those kinds of settings. Any
advice to a person who thinks they're being played by a psychopath?
Do your homework. One, learn as much about this as you can online. There's lots of websites and good sources of data on people that happen to fall into a relationship with a psychopath or are trying to survive a relationship with a psychopath. So there's some very good websites that focus on that. There's a lot of good science out there. My website has a lot of scholarly data on it concerning psychopathy. There's also a number of other, both online as well as books out there. One of Bob Hare's early books, called Without Conscience, is a great book to learn about psychopathy. But then most importantly, do your homework on individuals that you're starting to have a relationship with. Vet the individual. Do some background investigation on open source material on the person. Find out what you can about the individual. I don't think when we put stuff online, when stuff is out there on the internet about us, I don't think we can have any kind of reasonable expectation of privacy. And I think it's, in a sense, it's open to the world. You want to, in a sense, find out about a person, especially if you're moving to a more and more emotionally and physically intimate position with that individual. Find out as much as you can. Talk to people who know that person that you trust to find out how they are historically. Your best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. If you are beginning to become involved with an individual who's been married 5 times, it's likely that if you marry him, it's not going to last. So use your good judgment. Try to keep as rational and reasonable a mind about the individual as you can as you do that level of investigating.
So assess investigate, assess, and investigate.
Yes. Exactly. Yeah. And then the just the last thing, Adam,
sure.
About that is just watch for early warning signs, particularly for the women who are listening to that, who are single and are dating. We know there are early warning signs in a relationship that things are not going to go well. One of them is dominance. The male trying to dominate your behavior, trying to control your behavior. Even in the most subtle ways, wanting to know where you are most of the time, wanting to be able to make sure he knows via your iPhone where you're located. Those are all early warning signs of heading for trouble. Anything that speaks to dominance and control of you, we know is predictive of trouble down the road, including such very, very difficult and troubling behavior such as stalking. We know is one of the predictors of that is that level of dominance and control early on in a relationship.
I find myself thinking about sexual fetishes and BDSM. Is there a correlation between psychopathy and those who engage in that type of fetish?
Yeah, there's actually a large database now on sexual offending and psychopathy. We know that generally severity of psychopathy does predict a risk of sexual reoffense. That's well established in the research. The more severe the psychopathic individual is, the greater the likelihood that he will sexually reoffend again. That's a
sure history, yeah, for sure.
That he will reoffend again. So we know it's predictive. As you get into more coercive sexual activity, there's a greater likelihood of psychopathy being involved in the case. Forensically, I've done a number of cases through the years involving both serial murderers and sexual sadists and those combinations. And typically we find moderate to high levels of psychopathy in serial murders. We also, where typically you find a sexual sadist, there will also be a psychopathic personality. So any one sexually sadistic act is a indicator that there's a likelihood of psychopathy in the personality. So yes, there is any kind of coercive, hurtful sexual behavior is likely to be related to psychopathic personality traits.
And just to be sex positive here, there, I imagine, are many people who are of the BDSM community who are not psychopathic. Would that also be true?
Yeah, there's research on BDSM communities. A lot of the data tells us that those individuals, when it's kept at the level of non-coercive and non-criminal behavior, then of course that does not indicate psychopathy. But as soon as it moves to any kind of coercion where there's attempt to involuntarily control the person and consent of the person is set aside, we're getting into trouble, and we're getting into troubling personality waters if that is what the person prefers. Again, I've done a lot of sexual homicide cases, and we see in those cases a high degree of psychopathy, and a lot of times there were run-ups to that behavior involving coercive sexual activity, attempts to rape, things of that nature.
So it sounds like the key words here in terms of differentiating are consent, understanding limits, respect, and safe words, things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. The consent is critical. Any kind of there have been some great studies of college-age males, and they found that any college-age males who engage in coercive sexual activity, like try to get their girlfriends drunk so they can have intercourse with them, multiple duplicitous relationships, things of that nature. Typically, the males that do that tend to be more psychopathic than other males at college age.
So, Reid, it's my experience of you that you're a really nice guy, and here you are, a well-educated psychologist, and even someone who has gone above and beyond the doctoral level, getting your diplomatic status as a psychologist, as well as becoming a trained analyst. And yet you've done a deep dive into psychopathy. What brought you there?
Well, Adam, do you have another couple hours? Yeah, that's a tough one. You'd have to talk to my psychoanalyst to probably get the most honest appraisal of that. But early on, I was I've always been fascinated with extreme human behavior, and I think initially it became just a very, very large intellectual curiosity for me. And then I think as I became more involved in this world as an evaluator, as an assessor, as somebody who testifies in court, and there was more of an emotional connection to this, I began to find the complexities of understanding to be very, very challenging, and that these were dark areas that really needed exploration and needed understanding, and that I also recognized that I had the personality characteristics to do this work well. That I have a level of resilience. I have the intellect for this. I have the stability for this kind of work. Because make no bones about this, this is very, very dark work. As I've gotten older, I have titrated myself much more carefully than I did when I was younger. I don't actually do very many of these cases now. My actual evaluations of these individuals is infrequent. I also recognize, and this is kind of like the arc of my career, is over the past 20 years, I've moved into more preventive work rather than post-offense litigation work. So I now do a lot of work in threat assessment, threat management, helping to keep people safe, helping to prevent. And I see this, this podcast with you contributing to that, wanting to help people stay safer, keep them from harm, rather than coming in after the fact and, cleaning up the detritus, looking at the horrors that humans have committed and trying to examine them. So there's been an arc to my career to more preventive, more optimistic side. And just very specifically, I used to do some child sexual homicide cases, which are the worst of the worst. And I stopped doing that about 20 years ago, or no, about 15 years ago. I did my last one because I had too many death images in my mind, and I needed to move away from that because I knew it was affecting me deeply.
So I need to know, how do you apply self-care? In as much as you can't unsee what you've seen, unhear what you've heard, how do you apply self-care? Or what was effective for you?
Oh, I think like being in psychoanalysis has been very important to me. And I return to psychoanalysis periodically as a patient. It's very helpful to me. I have a loving wife and family. I have a 16-year-old daughter who loves to watch Criminal Minds with me. So
oh wow! And you can have.
I don't know what that's going to predict, but her investigative skills are really, really sharp. It's really quite fascinating. She actually wants to be a marine biologist, so I think she's going to go probably a healthier work for her own good. But I think a loving family, of course, just all the good stuff we think about, the emotional self-care of having close friends, giving back to your community. Doing things, recognizing that there's also very positive narcissistic aspects to our lives that we need to nurture. And one of those is emotional self-care. It's physical self-care, keeping your mind intellectually alive, keeping it open to other points of view. So those are all some of the things. But the titration of the darkness has been very, very important to me, especially over the past 15 years.
Fantastic. I've just got a couple more questions.
Sure.
Although if it were up to me, I'd be talking with you all day. You mentioned the positive sides of narcissism. We talked about the dark sides and even what is commonly thrown around as malignant narcissism, but there is an upside to narcissism. Can you actually speak to that?
Sure, yeah, that's real important, Adam. Narcissism is like blood pressure. Too much or too little is the problem. And healthy narcissism, narcissism gets a bad rap a lot. But there's healthy narcissism and there's pathological narcissism. Like for me, healthy narcissism just today was, getting up, taking a shower, putting on the clothes I wanted to wear for the day, having a healthy breakfast, catching up on the news, but not too much of it, so I don't get too depressed over what's going on in our country right now and in the world. But that's all healthy narcissism, taking care of oneself, nurturing oneself so that you can be resilient as possible. And out of that resiliency, you can take care of those that you love, and you can also receive with gratitude their love toward you. But narcissism also can get pathological, where it becomes, in a sense, a retreat into self-absorption and self-focus, which ironically, I think, makes you much more vulnerable and fragile to the slights and arrows of the world. As people become more self-focused and fixated on oneself and not paying attention to one's family, one's neighbors, the community at large, the nation, the world, and forget that we're all in this together, that brings with it, ironically, a fragility. And if you look at the most self-absorbed people you also will probably see a level of fragility that you don't see in your friends who are much more resilient and giving to other people. And one of the ways in pathological narcissism that we see that fragility is a reactivity to any slight criticism or insult. And the reactivity is oftentimes manifest in rage or intense anger or sudden explosive behavior. And that, in a sense, that's about their fragility.
Go ahead.
Well, I know it's kind of a long monologue, but I think
it's great.
But this will be, there's a good metaphor that I use when I teach, and that the pathological narcissist is like an inflated balloon that's inflated as much as it possibly can be. And a maximally inflated balloon is vulnerable to any slight pinprick.
Sure.
And it will deflate suddenly. That deflation is the feeling of humiliation. And that humiliation, particularly in men, is typically followed by rage. Now, that grossly inflated balloon is the pathological narcissist that's vulnerable to the slightest pinprick. It's fragile. But if you think about those of us who try to just have our balloons partially inflated, and what I mean by that is we recognize our abilities and our skills and our strengths, and we call the emotions attached to those pride. Pride is healthy narcissism. But because our balloons are only partially inflated, we also recognize that we have vulnerabilities, we have areas we don't know that much about, we have areas of incompetency, we have limits to our skills, limits to our knowledge, limits to our to the emotions that we can feel and express. But notice that a partially inflated balloon is much more resilient to any pinpricks. You can take a partially inflated balloon and stick it with a pin all you want, and nothing happens. That's because it's resilient. And so I hope with that metaphor you can see the fragility of the inflated narcissist versus the resilient narcissism of the healthy person.
That's a perfect metaphor, and it can feel so counterintuitive and surprising to know about the fragility of the narcissist, the person who ostensibly is so into themselves that they would appear to be a lot less fragile, and in fact, they are very, Fragile.
But one of the things, Adam, though, with that fragility, though, in my forensic world, though, that can also be very dangerous.
I think so.
Because that rage in extreme cases can lead to homicide.
Exactly.
Fragility can lead to rage, which can result in a homicide. We see that in domestic violence, sadly, in domestic violence cases, as an example.
Right. And I would also imagine that one of the other things with the less inflated balloon involves the capacity to introspect and to live in the realm of I don't know. Just the capacity to say, let's find out, I don't know, rather than I know without any equivocation the answer to this question.
Yeah, that's great. I learned that early on my years as a witness, as an expert witness on the stand, is that if you say I don't know a few times to a jury, they really, really like it and they trust you more because you recognize the limits of your competency and your knowledge. But if you say I don't know too many times, they think you're an idiot. So
exactly.
You have to be very, very careful when you testify to not use I don't know too many times.
Right. And I don't know is, I wasn't suggesting an overdose of I don't know, but the recognition that that we live in a world of maybe from time to time rather than certainty.
Yeah, and I think right now too, it's really hard for people to stay in the gray.
Exactly.
To recognize that we're in a time right now of uncertainty and ambiguity, and it's very hard for some people to tolerate staying within that uncertainty and ambiguity, and they will instead gravitate to a binary view of the world. That's our enemy. We're at war. Those people are bad. We are good. And binary views generally distort reality. And we have to be real careful about that, because then you can get into, of course, extremist thinking and all the things that come with moving to a very, very black and white view of the world.
Yeah. It looks like I may have been wrong. I may have a couple more questions, but one of the things that really disturbed me in my studies of psychopathy is that there is no known treatment for treating a person who is a psychopath. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, that's correct. For adult psychopathy, there's no known treatment for psychopathy, and that's something that I hope your viewers will take to heart. However, one of the approaches in working with psychopathic patients is how can the treatment manage the psychopathy that's apparent in this case? How can it be worked with so not interfere with other potential gains the patient can make? And then also we need to keep in mind too that for those folks that are listening, particularly parents of children that may be behaving in ways that are troubling or they're frightened by, is make sure you get a good consult. We know that we can be much more optimistic about psychopathic traits in children if treatment is applied fairly readily and people do not turn away from perhaps clear facts that they're facing. One of the shortcomings in my field, and what I mean by my field is the mental health field in general, is there's a lot of misunderstanding of psychopathy. And but the good news is there's also lots of experts and lots of people that know a lot about it that are available for help and consultation.
That's really heartening to know, and I imagine there are so many misconceptions about psychopathy. My second to last question: is there anything I should have asked but haven't yet asked?
No, it's been great, Adam. I've really enjoyed doing this with you, and no, I think we've covered a lot of important areas in understanding the psychopath.
Well, then my final question is: if you had a wish for the study of psychopathy, what would it be, and do you think it could come true?
Yeah, if I had a wish for it, I would want there to be more formal study of not only psychopathy as a as a psychopathology, but also the study of psychopathy and psychopathic traits and as adaptive characteristics. I think that's been a shortcoming of the research. Research tends to be funded in this area only if you view psychopathy as a disorder, not if you think about psychopathy as having certain traits that may be adaptive for the individual but are very destructive in society. It's very hard for people to accept that there are aspects of within our species that we can't fix, that we can't treat. But by accepting that, then we move away from denying that there's anything to learn. If you accept that there are certain aspects in the species that can't be treated, I think it opens the door to a much kind of fuller understanding of what is this about and how can we better able cope with it in our society.
Since it's already here.
Right.
How can, yeah, got it.
Yeah.
Well, Reid, thank you so much for sharing your time and your wisdom. I'm sure all of my listeners are going to really benefit from this greatly.
Thanks. It was a real pleasure doing this with you. Best wishes. Okay. Bye-bye.
This is Dr. Adam Dorsey thanking you for listening to Super Psyched. To listen to other great episodes or to get more information about today's episode, please visit me at my website, dradamdorsey.com. That's DradamDorsay.com, and click the Super Psyched podcast link.